Hello, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1036th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the absolute pleasure and privilege to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Lubaina Himid and Dr. Omar Kholeif. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Throughout a career spanning 4 decades, Lubaina Himid has explored and expanded the possibilities of painting and storytelling to depict contemporary everyday life and to fill gaps in art history through the centering of Black figures and experiences. A self-described painter and cultural activist, Himid rose to prominence in the 1980s as a pioneer of the British Black arts movement and a staunch advocate for the contributions of women of color to the visual arts. She is the recipient of both the 2023 Maria Lassnig Prize and the 2024 Suzanne Deal Booth Flag Art Foundation Prize, among others, and her first exhibition at Greene Naftali will open in New York this May. Dr. Omar Kholeif was born in Cairo to Egyptian and Sudanese parents. They are a British artist, curator, author, historian, and broadcaster who has curated more than 70 exhibitions and produced over 100 commissions of film and visual art on 5 continents. Kholeif is Director of Collections and Senior Curator at Sharjah Art Foundation and the founder and co-director of Art Post 21. Dr. Kholeif is a visiting professor in critical race, visual art history, and the creative industries at the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art Research Unit at Teesside University in the United Kingdom. Their hybrid social history of art and technology, internet art, from the birth of the web to the rise of NFTs, was published by Phaidon in 2023. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Omar to get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Chloe, and to everyone for being here. It's I'm a little bit out of the Zoom loop because we don't use these platforms as much to have public conversations. It's more for all the secret private things that we all do behind the scenes, like condition report checking, discussing damaged artworks and the like, all the pleasurable things in life, really. But I wanted to begin today's session with a little bit of a preface. It's very brief, but it's important, and it's really just for Lubaina more than anybody. Everything is for Lubaina in this regard. So preface. Frank, why do you love Lubaina so much? What an odd question. I mean, you can't stop talking about her all the time. Is she your favorite artist? You can't ask a so-called curator that. Frank, but you're not a so-called curator, Dr. O. Why are you asking me this? I respond. Because I want to talk about Lubaina. Why do you want to talk about Lubaina? That is none of your business. It's private. Well, I think it's not fair. I just wanted to know more about the colors. I really love the colors. She's making such amazing work now. What's that place called in Clerkenwell? Bushy Gallery. Dagger Eyes, correction, Hollybush Gardens, London. Well, I am going to tell her what you said about her work. Please don't, then she'll think I am some sycophant trying to get something out of her. I just wanted to talk to you about Lubaina and her work. I think that you are afraid to admit it, but she's your favorite artist. And if she's not your favorite artist, then she's the first person to matter to you in a long time. I would say since Auntie Jean died, and those are no small shoes to fill. I really resent that, I responded. Actually, I think that you really you just hate me, don't you? Lubaina and Jean did not much like each other, I don't think, or at least that's what someone told me. But they're very similar, you are right. So are you going to tell me or what? Can we talk about, Frank, speaking now, can we talk about those colors in those paintings from Hollybush? I love it when her brushes go wild. I love it when you know you make it so difficult. At this point, I was going to ask if we could zoom to slides 3, Chloe. Well, I should have said that when we talked about the brushes. And then follow that with slide 24. Those are the brushes that he was talking about. Frank, you're always so mean to me. Me. Well, I am dizzy because I don't know how to put into words how I feel. It's like she's devoured my whole world into her belly and just, well, put it out there. It's like Sontag on Artaud and consciousness, Frank interjects, do you want a Tesco ham and cheese sandwich? Cut, stop, and breathe. And the reason I begin this way is because these are the kinds of conversations that I have about Lubaina Himid almost every day with my partner, Frank. And one of the most interesting aspects is that his desire to acquaint himself with the very details, the very moments of conjuring that emerged in and through Lubaina Hamid's work. They're not one-liners for me to answer, and they'll be interrupted by, do you want a Tesco ham and cheese sandwich? And I'm never prepared for that, you see. So we always end up in a fight. But Lubaina has met Frank and approves and doesn't think that he's a monster nor that he hates me, which is good. So with that, I think we should continue this introduction, which is to say that, yes, it is always an honor to be spending time with you, Lubaina. Even if this is not my podcast, Listening with Artists, run by Dr. Rowe in their metaverse computer. But Lubaina Himid is a very special person, a one-of-a-kind person, a person who's more fun to hang out with than Joan Collins. I can attest to that. An individual with more secret codes to hand than James Bond could ever dream of. A painter who uses the canvas to experiment not only with the language of art's history, but also with the social sphere of the public, the social sphere that we experience today, every day, as human beings in our quotidian acts of life, but also in our political lives. She's an artist who's generous enough to stage or share the stage that she uses with other artists, many of whose careers she has nurtured. She's an artist who, yes, was the first Black woman to win the Turner Prize, and we have discussed this at length, this kind of appendage, a very important prize here in Britain. But she was making waves in the realm of culture from the very beginning of her career. As a burgeoning cellist, as a poet who won the Observer Poetry Competition in her teenage years, as a theater designer, and someone who designed cutouts for Tuttons in Covent Garden. Then on to the RCA, where she called out in the media for young Black artists to send her work. But opening the Elbow Room, a space for experiments in Black art and creativity, first in Borough and then on Martella Street, was another adventure that very few artists would do today. A risk, a burden that Lubaina carried largely on her own. And through that process, she was indeed acknowledged to a degree and revered by some, but also perhaps I wonder if her honesty was too much for the world in Britain in the 1980s to handle. When she appeared in The State of the Art in 1986 on Channel 4 to speak of why Black art was different, but not different, if you see what I mean, maybe what they really wanted to hear was actually it was different and exotic. When she created several significant shows of Black women's art in the mid-1980s, what did the public want? Or indeed, what did the so-called art world want? Was it a little bit more of a market reverie? When she had a solo show at Chisenhale Gallery in 1989, who would have expected that a tube strike would affect the possibilities of her being truly seen? But today, Lubaina Himid is seen And it is an incredible privilege to be able to be with Lubaina after having attended the opening of Make Do Amend at the Austin Contemporary, the result of the Suzanne Deal Booth Flag Art Foundation Prize, because it is truly a feat and a gift to audiences. In fact, it's perhaps the largest show of exclusively new work to be shown in a single museum context by Lubaina, if not ever, but then in a very long time, because despite the incredible grandeur of the Tate survey, Lubaina Himid, here everything was made new and new, and being able to engage with that liveness of thought has been just incredible. And I encourage you all to see it not only in Austin, but then see it in Austin and see it again when it comes to New York to the Flag Art Foundation, because it will be a completely different show. Because having worked with Lubaina Himid, I can tell you that every single show is different. So with that, I shall be a little bit more quiet. First, I just want to ask, Lubaina, how was your day?
Well, busy, but perhaps yes, in a peculiar way. I was talking a lot this morning on Zoom. Then I was wrapping prints with Magda in the print room. And then here I am now. So I was thinking about painting, looking at my work as it was being wrapped, but I wasn't doing any painting. Well, I did a tiny bit of painting very, very early this morning. I got up, came to this studio, thought, oh, I just need to do this tiny little thing with a painting that's on the go. But I only spent 10 minutes in here, and then I got on with my day in a different way.
Well, I'm happy to know that you at least got those pleasurable 10 minutes. Not that the other things weren't pleasurable, but it is actually leads to a question I wanted to ask, which is when you left London to move first, I suppose around when you were an exhibition officer in Oldham, and then moved to Preston, where you primarily live and work today. That was because it was just incredibly difficult to live in London. Uh, and you spent many years, decades, teaching full-time fine art. But now you are emeritus. And in a sense, your time is yours to pick and choose what you do with that time. And it would be really illuminating to know, how has that liberation from the structure of, say, the academic sphere changed the way you engage with your process and practice of making art?
It was interesting. It was a Rochdale Art Gallery, actually, that I came to in the 1980s, where the curators there were kind of really forward-thinking in their promotion, encouragement, and nurturing of feminist artists and of Black artists. But I guess the difference between the way I work now and the way I worked when I was full-time teaching is that well, I can't really blame anybody else for anything anymore, which is unfortunate because, you know, it was quite good to do that. But in a sense, in the way that I work, that getting up, that going to a making space in my house, even before I go to a making space in the middle of town, that going to that making space, starting the day as the artist that I am, is what I've always done. So that is absolutely no different. And because I learned to do that from day one of teaching, so it doesn't matter how busy that teaching day was going to be, I went to the studio first and knew that I was going to make the breakfast and teach and go to meetings as an artist, because I'd started the day as an artist. And I'd had a conversation with the work that was always ongoing. And that's no different. There's always something on the go. And in those days, I had a lot of shows. It's just people didn't talk about them as much as they talk about them now. So there was always something that was on the go, drawings or paintings or cutouts or collages or whatever. So in many, many ways, nothing has changed, except that if I don't do as much work in the day, it's because I'm talking to curators, or I'm talking to gallerists, or perhaps doing events like this, rather than listening to students.
Well, actually, just to pick up on that, you are not someone, you're someone who's known to be particularly private, uh, in and you're not someone who necessarily gives many public talks. You'll talk to journalists and academics and curators in those intimate spheres. But I remember when we attended your Royal Academy talk not so long ago, it was something that you revealed to me, and I think. Well, it surprised me because I assumed that you had uh, created that, I suppose, that persona, maybe that had emerged from teaching, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how this kind of interest, if you will, from curators and gallerists and other folk that has emerged really since in the last 10 years with a different kind of, I suppose, political fervor, strategic fervor, might have affected the ways that you choose to present your work or aspects of your life.
Well, I don't know. You know, if you start to do something at 18 and then you carry on doing it in different sorts of ways, different kinds of economic situations, and then you're doing it through 30 years of teaching, you kind of tend to do, I kind of tend to do it in the same way. It doesn't really make all that much difference to the way I talk about the work. If you ask me a question about the work, I would tell you anything you want to know. If you ask me a question about my life, I'd say, well, how long have you got? How many hours have you got to listen to me talk about this? Because it's long and it's complicated. So much of that thinking about me as a very private person is just, it's just long and complicated.
But
And
people don't want to hear long and complicated stories.
I'm much more interested in talking about the work,
Mm.
and to hear about maybe what the work made you do, or made you think, or made you remember. You know, I'm kind of more interested in that
Well,
than,
actually, sorry, pardon me.
I suppose, more interested in that than talking about myself, unless you're, you know, going for a walk with me, or having dinner with me, or living with me. And then those people would say, she loves to talk about herself.
Well, yeah, well, so we shouldn't tell our publisher this, as we've just signed a book deal to right to work on a memoir of Lubaina's life. So we won't be telling them that. But let's go into the work then on that note. And I because I want to begin actually with Make Do Amend and the ground floor of the exhibition. But before, to contextualize it, I think it's important because we are speaking in a sense to in some cases a new audience in the United States. Some may have been very much engaged with the new museum exhibition, some not, that happened around 2017, if I'm not mistaken. But you used to refer to yourself as more of a political strategist than an artist. Then you started to refer to yourself as a painter who's also a political strategist. And I just want to clarify what this means, because the paintings on the ground floor at the Contemporary are part of a series of strategy paintings. So maybe you could illuminate what you meant by when you used to say, I'm more of a political strategist, and then now it's a painter and a political strategist.
Well, I suppose I spent many, many decades, along with quite a few other people, trying to change the shape of British art history. I'm not sure we always knew that that's what we were trying to do, but in hindsight, I think that's what we were trying to do in a very naive way, maybe in the beginning, in a kind of bitter and twisted way in the middle, with a bit more energy as more and more feminist art historians became interested in unpicking and unpacking exactly what I seem to be trying to say with this work. And I think that all those years spent with many of us doing things in different sorts of ways, not always agreeing that this was the right way to do it. You know, we all thought we had the right way to do it. And I'm very up for that, because I think the more people that actually think that they have the right way to do it in those kind of changing the landscape, the more likely one of those ways is going to work.
Mm.
I'm totally in favor of that. And I think as the years went by, more and more people who were interested in art became more interested in this kind of work that many of us were doing. We became less and less interested in talking about that strategy, and more interested in being able to do experiments, experiment with color, or experiment with paint, or experiment with working on found objects. And then therefore talking about that became, okay, who is brave enough to let me have a show my work, and not have this be about the color of my skin. Let it be about, what the hell are you doing there? Well, how did you do that? Where did this come from? Why is it like that? What conversations are going on? And I began to understand a lot more. I mean, I'd been listening to artists for 35 years, but I began to understand more and more that there was something also liberating and energizing about speaking about the work rather than speaking about the difficulties of showing it. And as many of us allowed each other to do that, the difficulties in showing it became less and less.
So it's really about it was an amplification occurred and it succeeded. And so now let us, for example, turn to slide 9, and if we may, Chloe, and enter into this world and look at this work, because although it is beautiful, it is from a physical perspective, every single one of these paintings, I believe, can create different visceral resonances and dissonances of each person. But I want to look at this slide on slide 9, because it's very interesting how it's set up, that you've put this table in the middle of this space, which has all these incredible paintings. And if you look at the paintings, there's something happening, is that they're all around a table. And I wanted to ask about, I suppose, the provocation or the question, because the question, the space between the question and the answer, is a part of the storytelling, I suppose. Maybe we could begin by just thinking about this setup, the context that you've created here in this room.
Well, I think from the very beginning, when I was talking to the curators at the gallery, which was difficult, because I was talking about work that I hadn't yet made, and it is so difficult to do. But I was absolutely sure that I wanted to make a series of paintings of people trying to work out enormous problems using found objects as the sort of perhaps sometimes replacing words with objects, so that if you moved objects around the room, perhaps while you're trying to sort of negotiate how to give up your power rather than how to take power, that it would create a space in which you would have maybe, I think in this case, there are 24 people altogether in 10 paintings doing this very thing about very, issues that are too big really to talk about. What are monuments for? Should we be favoring forests or farming? What is care? Can care be poisonous? So big issues, but they're very difficult issues to discuss. So I think, okay, I set myself this problem. How can I depict this challenge and also show that it's people having these discussions, people having these conversations, and there are always other layers of relationship going on while people are trying to argue something, discuss something, get nearer, get further apart. And I wanted to show that at the same time. So I wanted these things to have several layers within the 6 foot by 6 foot, but also in the room, set up a scenario where if you wanted to come to do something simple, maybe to have a discussion with your book group, or something more complicated, you wanted to come and discuss how the city of Austin might be, some real estate might be developed, or you wanted to talk about how your university department feels slightly under siege, you could do it in an environment where 24 other people were also having big, important meetings while having minute personal relationships, and how the moving around of these objects sometimes distracts, sometimes enhances, and sometimes illustrates the challenges and conversations that are going on. So the audience then becomes part of the paintings. So if you sit at a table, then you're at your own table, maybe on your own, but probably with other people who, if they see you sit at this table, so you can touch the artwork if you like. So you sit at the table, you can talk to people at this table, and at the same time you can see the way that these other 24 people are doing it. And I'm interested to know, but I'm interested for people to know whether it changed the nature of their meeting while they were having being surrounded by these other people having meetings. What did that mean to them? Or was it just much nicer to have a meeting in an art gallery than it is in an airless office?
Or a corporate coffee shop.
Yes, indeed. Nicer or more useful or less intimidating, or do you get to say different things because you can see that there are sort of different layers of things going on in your conversation that may or may not be happening in these other people's conversations. It was just setting up a sort of a way also for audiences to really feel part of the performance and part of the action, if you like.
I'd like to move to slide 6 and pick up on the word that you just ended with, their performance, which is that, would it be fair to say that every exhibition that you stage is indeed a stage for performance and encounter, because the work doesn't fully become animate until the visitor brings with them their set of imaginings, convenings, and subjectivities, because that was very evident in your Tate Modern show, where you really asked those questions, and it was staged literally like a theatre play. But having spent time with the work, it literally is that every painting is waiting for a person, and that there's maybe, would it be fair to say, an ambiguity, a sense of ambiguity that's left open for the person to fill in or bring themselves to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's totally the point of the table. I mean, I sort of first used that device in some of those revenge paintings back in the 90s. Then again in a painting called The Operating Table, sort of in the sort of 2020, I think. I was, or 2019, no, 2020, I think.
2020 was, yeah.
Yep. Sorry to the art historians out there. I'm really terrible at the date thing. But the point is, you as an audience member can choose or not to, the table's there. There's room at the table for you. There's room to pretend or to actually be there in the conversation. And that's pretty important to me. It's like when you, absolutely, when you're in a theatre space as opposed to a cinema space, where it actually makes a difference to the performance of the protagonists on the stage or in the drama. It makes a difference how the audience is. A Tuesday afternoon audience is very different often from a Saturday night audience. You've come to the theatre for kind of different reasons. You've come to a performance in a different place in your week. And so there's an opportunity, say with this painting here, to watch these people being persuasive and not being persuasive. There's an opportunity to observe how they are using the objects on the table, trees and animals, to discuss the difference between forests and farming. But on another level, you look out of the window to the side and they're having this discussion in a landscape of mountains and lakes. So it's like that's a bit like when you live in a town and the traffic system doesn't work in any way. Like here in Preston, the traffic system is very peculiar and odd, and it bypasses all sorts of things it ought to go through and goes through things it ought to bypass. And we often say, clearly, the person who designed this traffic system lived in Manchester, because it's much better to try to solve something if you at least understand the challenge that you've got, rather than to assume that you know what the challenge must be because you live in a different kind of world. So this is probably the painting where there is the most active persuading going on, some of the most active trying not to persuade going on, and the most oppositional environment in which the balance of discussion is tipping.
And I mean, I on slide 7 and slide 8 was zooming in at the details to try and understand what were these animals. And it was when I kind of zoomed in, I suppose, that I understood that there was a disjuncture somehow between the topography that was in front of them and the one that was outside. And I couldn't quite tell, and I don't know if that was intentional, if the space inside was completely imagined, a space that wasn't actually in that situation or not. And I felt that I was invited to kind of make that decision to a degree for myself, because the question of true and perfect plot, which is your titles are also very important, is in a sense an impossible. There is no really such thing as a true and perfect plot, because eventually there is always something that emerges to be incongruent with it. And I think that what's particularly also quite alluring about it is that there is this kind of colorful backdrop, the pink and the purple, which kind of that create a kind of hyper awareness of these kind of two temporal orders. And was any of that about experimenting with color as well? Because the colors, I mean, I reference Frank's obsession with your color schematic, but colors, there is a gestural action that is very visible. There is an ebullience. There's also moments of very mattedness. There are several moments where the skin and the body moves into the landscape. And what was some of the thought, or I suppose possibilities, that you felt enabled with conjuring these specific sets of paintings, using these as examples?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in always several things at once. Certainly the place, and sometimes it's very important the place, where the work will be shown. That place is important. Whatever place that is has a history. I'm interested in that history. The gallery in Austin once was a cinema, once was a department store, has been all sorts of different kind of things, and an art gallery and then not an art gallery. So I'm interested in the place where the work is being shown, as well as the people who supposedly usually come to that place and space. Then I'm interested in disrupting that place somehow, but not in a way. In this particular iteration, very often I want the work to seem as if it comes from that place. In the new museum in 2019, I made some paintings called Metal Handkerchiefs, which I wanted to feel as if they were embedded. They were made on very thin sheets of zinc, embedded in the walls of that gallery in the new museum, as if it was a blank wall and you'd scraped away, and then underneath the scraping were then these metal paintings. So with these paintings, I wanted them to sort of feel to an audience as if these paintings belonged in that space, so that they could hardly remember what was on the last time they came, and the next time they come, there might be a kind of trace, a hint, a breath, a stain of what was there when my show was there. And then when you're in the space with those paintings, there are these gestures and facial interactions between the protagonists in the paintings where I don't know what's going on. I think the protagonists sometimes know what's going on. They know who's there. They quite often don't know who isn't there. And I think that happens to us all the time when we are walking on a street or when we're in a room. Very often people that we remember are in the room with us, even though they're not in the room with us. So I'm trying to deal with that. And then talking is very difficult for many people. Listening is very difficult for other people. And so the use of objects, which I love to paint in painstaking detail, as opposed to the rooms, which are painted with a kind of exuberance and a flamboyance. And then there are these details that are painstakingly caressed and nurtured and yeah, crafted into being. But I love to try to do all three of these things at once, in a series of paintings, so that there are many ways in. But I want to get some kick out of making this work, and so being very free with the color in the first place and very liberal with the combinations is exciting. But then there needs to be some kind of awkward tension, and that's where the people come in. And then there needs to be some challenge. How difficult is it to paint a toy soldier? How fun is it to paint a lemon? How obsessive is it to paint a gondola? You know, so there are those things, or shells, you know, there are those things that I paint over and over again that I'm always trying to do better. Not more realistically, but better.
I think that's when in my preface I talk about I feel like you've swallowed my whole world. I'm referring to this very way that you've articulated something about painting that I think is very art historically significant. You've just laid out the strategies, which is, you know, the detail in the object is tied to a certain history and politics. And you've also painted on found objects and made cutouts. The looseness at times, the experiment in the background can also be read in many other ways. I mean, they can be read in the histories of all kinds of painting, but to you, there are specific things that you keep wanting, you say, to do better. And I've moved us to divided loyalties because I think this is one of the best kettle situations, if it is a kettle even, I've ever seen you paint or anyone paint. And it's one of those paintings that I had the fortune to see in the studio before it left. And it's one of those paintings that I think, well, I almost don't want to say anything because it's there. I mean, maybe we just move for 1 second to slide 24 to that detail of the hand on the arm and then go back to slide 23. I mean, it's called divided loyalties. Clearly, there was maybe figures there that were painted out or not. And when I read the title in the gallery, I couldn't decide if the divided loyalties were between you and yourself, or between the two characters, or indeed the three characters, because I can see that there was a third one that may have been painted out as well. I'm not entirely sure, but I find that the spectral, ghostly, haunting aspect of this work is incredibly prevalent in space, but it's also not a dark painting somehow. It still is one that is filled and brimming with life. And those, when you call them tensions maybe, but they're also, you're playing with the very notion of contradiction in painting in terms of the setting up, but also moving objects across temporal orders so that we're not quite so sure if that kettle was made, you know, in the 1920s, or is it a replica, or is it, or, so we're also temporally dislodged. Those aspects, I think, when we come to think about the issue of representation, racial representation or not, is important, because I think you're creating space. And one of the arguments that I often say is that you often can read your work as a way of creating a manifold space for so many others to enter. And I think that that's a gift that you have as an artist, is in the work itself. There is a generosity through a very laborious work process that can sometimes just seem like it's porous in its richness. But maybe you could tell us about the story or process behind divided loyalties, because I may be completely way off, right?
No, not so way off, really. It was a painting that was difficult to do. There were 5 people in the painting, and so it was really crowded, more crowded than the others. And all of these people were kind of just making too much noise. They weren't doing that thing that I'm trying to paint, as you hinted at earlier on, that moment between the question and the answer. Nobody was listening. Everybody was talking. They all had different clothes from very different eras on, which I did on purpose, but then they were making too much noise, really. So, and I was trying to perfect this painting, or perfect. I was just trying to finish it. I think perfect. No, not that doesn't often happen with me. I was just trying to finish it. And Magda Stavaska, who works with me a lot, and is my partner, came into the studio, and not many people were allowed in the studio really in that kind of spontaneous sort of way. And she was talking to me, and I was listening, but I can't remember what she was saying. So I clearly wasn't listening as much as I thought I was listening. But she was talking and talking and talking and talking. But it was one of those beautiful moments. Like very often I'm listening to a football game on the radio and painting. But it was sort of that, where I was listening and I was making a visual picture of what she was saying. But it was so comforting because she was there. And I suddenly knew that this was the moment to paint all these people out. So I just got a brush and I just started to paint them out. And she kept talking and I kept painting. And then all the other people except this person were gone. But of course, they are still there, but they're gone. You can see the fingerprints on this person's arm because you can tell that those other people in the room were just too close. They were not keeping their distance from this person who was quiet, was listening, does have something to say. And I thought actually that they needed to be actually in the room, and these other people needed to have been in the room and been and gone from the room. And so they're there, but they're not there. They're there for that person. They're not that much there for us as an audience, but the awkwardness and the tension is between the kettle and the glass, because of course a kettle and a glass are no use to each other. Point is, there's no use to each other whatsoever. You pour something from a metal kettle into a glass, you don't have the glass anymore.
That violence was what I was curious about.
Well, I took the objects, I stole them directly from a Hogarth engraving. And the series is called The Harlot's Progress. And the woman in question is in her parlor, and her slave servant, little boy, has the kettle in his hand. And a visiting suitor has the glass in his hand. And so, and I'm very interested indeed in print, in engravings, in Hogarth, and in that juxtaposition of objects that kind of go together but are clearly useless. I made a painting many, many years ago called A Jug and Two Spoons. I still have it, I think. A table, a jug, and two spoons on the table. And of course, the jug and two spoons, it's no use to each other. It's very difficult to make use of the liquid in the jug with two spoons. I mean, you can do it, but they don't go together. They're sort of awkward and tense. So the awkwardness and tension is between the objects. Which one will this person engage with, the kettle or the glass? While all this clamor is going on, who knows? This is the moment of decision between the clamor and the decision between the objects.
And one thing that you touched upon was the Rake's Progress, the Hogarth series. Of course, the work often pulls from and cites intertextually different art historical references, but what I find distinct is that you are really looking at the specificity of that object, that detail. But We don't have time now to talk about the show you did with Magda Stavarska, who, by the way, I should mention is also a dear friend of mine and an incredible artist who has a book forthcoming and about her work, published by Sternberg Press. Please pre-order it now. Um, uh,
Do
uh,
pre-order it now. I'm saying it as well.
Yes, it's an incredible travelogue, and Magda Slavarsky and you did work on a show together, and actually maybe we should talk about this. You and Magda Slavarsky spent a lot of time in something called the Print Studio in Preston, which is part of the university. It was a big part of it's a significant part of this of the school there, and one of the things that's quite amazing is seeing, I suppose, the master in terms of, I always assume that you're the master, but, as in terms of historical references and painting, become a kind of voracious, capacious student who's looking at the porosity of how things work in silkscreen printing, for example. As I've seen you in that studio of Magda. Could you just maybe illuminate or tell us a bit about the time that you spend in that studio and how important print culture is to you? Because it is a big part of the work. And working with Magda, as we know, is an important part of your work because you and I and Magda did a show together in Sharjah, Plait of Time, Deep Water, soon to be traveling to Mudam in Luxembourg. So maybe you could let us know some more.
Yeah, I think we've always had conversations, maybe for the last 15, 20 years, something like that, about about print, about how to push it around, how I'm constantly just entranced by the flexibility, the possibility of what she does with ink, how she mixes colors I can't mix, how she understands opacity and viscosity and luminosity. I understood so much more about layering by looking at what she does and talking to her. And in the print room, the sort of the way we work has sort of changed in some ways, in that now we're very often making marks on the same surface. So I will be making painter's marks, I'll be painting, and then she will print over the top of that. And then sometimes I will paint over the top of that. But it's a conversation about what print can do, what gesture is, what layering is, what language is, what text is. And we're talking while we're making. I'm standing there. If we're in the print room, I'm just standing there, and she is actually pulling the prints. But we're talking about the color and how we might play with the images as she is doing it. So it's very much a continuation of the conversations that we have when we're not making print. And of course, she has her own practice, which is, what you know very well about. And that's what I find interesting, that as someone who makes work with sound, makes work with moving image, paints as well, then when a person like that is in the print room, you know that they're bringing all that with them, rather than simply, although I'm a great admirer of that, simply a mastery of the medium of printing. When I say I can, that something we're working on, I can hear it, or I can't hear it yet. I know she understands that.
Well,
So yeah.
I love, opacity, viscosity, and luminosity, really, I think are the aspects that from this myriad disciplines appear in that room when you are together, and it often comes through the listening that happens between the two of you. And I'd just like to move to slide 15 for a second, because also the idea of listening is, I think, important in that when one enters your spaces, sometimes there is sound, such as with work such as Naming the Money, there's voice, but sometimes that sound is totally in one's head, in the sense that it's one that you bring. But on that note, as we are both fans of listening to certain things, I really didn't know you listened to football. I'm a bit surprised about that. But may you illuminate us with what it is that you most often listen to while you're painting in the studio? And does it soothe you or get on your nerves when you're listening to those things? How does it work?
Oh, well, if it gets on my nerves, I have to take it off. It's there, whatever it is I'm listening to, whether it's football, whether it's music, whether it's or an audio book, or whether it's yeah, some kind of, you know, documentary program or whatever on BBC. It's to distract me. It's to take the tension away from feeling too much while I'm painting. I need to feel quite a lot, but I need to be brave, and I need to take risks. And if it's silent, then the voices of doubt might override the voice of risk. And the great thing about football is, and on British radio on Saturday afternoons mostly, Sunday afternoons as well, there are men talking about 22 other men running about up and down a football pitch, and they're describing in great detail what those 22 men are doing, what they're wearing, how they're running, how they're passing the ball. And if you know the game, then you can see what they're saying. And that distracts you from how can I make this blue bluer? Or how can I make this blue work next to this purple now that I've been foolish enough to put a background of green? I get distracted by you know, some young millionaire running up the pitch, and I can see him, and I'm then have the courage to sort of put the paint on, or I'm distracted so much that I'm doing it. So it's a way of me being in the painting without being in it in a melancholic sort of way.
You
Sorry.
say something that's very effective, which is, you know, the tension away from feeling too much, which I find to be an important point to kind of meditate on. And maybe we could move to slide 16, because in a sense, the spaces of exhibitions that you create are, as we discussed, sites where where the audience is positioned in between, in the interstices of moments of histories, but they're really also subjected to moments where they are overcome with incredible feeling. And I've spoken a lot about and written a lot about how, especially the COVID world, and the opening up and sharing of loss and grief that happened in those moments has led to a much more to what I called an age of anxiety, and now in art, and now an age of feeling, and something that builds upon a friend and colleague of yours, I suppose, Griselda Pollock's important work on trauma theory, feminist art, and affect. But what I'm really talking about is the possibility of feeling, being able to create scenarios and narratives that allow for new forms of imagination to emerge, ones that are not necessarily tethered to those painful pasts, but are aware of them. And when I came to go up the stairs of the Austin Contemporary, the building is kind of shaped, the Jones Center is kind of like a bit like a ship. There's something very ship-like about it. And I came up to see this incredible work called Aunties, which, if we look at slide 16, is a series of pictures of details of these planks of wood, but they're not really planks of wood. They're actually numerous things. They could be a picture frame that's been appropriated. There's so many different things. But when I went into it, I may have told you at the time, I couldn't stop and help but feel that I was in the belly of a slave ship. And it may have been that I've been listening to too many audiobooks in relation to my work that is trying to, I suppose, find a language for those of us who want to talk critically and speak critically about race, but not be beholden to it in terms of our ontology and our ocular perspective. But I don't have any idea if that's what you intended, because when I went to see the show again with our friend Judy, she said, "Shh, move away from me and let the aunties speak." So I know why the work is called Aunties, but maybe you could tell us why it's called Aunties and what it's about, because it's something that is very hard, very complex to evoke, I think, and it was a really special encounter.
Well, I think the work came from, two other sets of work. The set of work that lots of people know that I made in the early 2000s, I think, called Naming the Money, 100 painted wooden cutouts of...
2004, yeah.
Yep, oh, good. And those. So it's something that comes from those, but also from the piece of work you mentioned that was in 2019 in the New Museum, called Old Boat, New Money. And so I wanted to fill the room with the women that hang out together in either in our houses or at weddings or at parties or on street corners or in the back gardens or on balconies, talking and solving the world's or their families' situations. They're the women who wonder why you're wearing that pair of shoes. They're the women who wonder why on earth you're marrying that person. They're the women who let you eat ice cream in the street when your mother won't let you. But they're also the women that make you take your shoes off before you come into their house, and their upholstery is all covered in plastic to make sure that when you put your sticky hands on the arm of the sofa, none of your stickiness is going to be left behind. They're those kinds of women that occupy many young people's worlds, and they're not always the sisters of your mother or your father. They are just women that belong in your environment, in your world. And they're also about how miraculously, goodness knows how this happens, I have become one of those people without actually realizing it. That actual world that I lived in, where women were in and out of my mother's house, my auntie was and I was in and out of my mother's house. They've all died now because, of course, they were much older than I was. So, but in that kind of strange intervening place that is my life, I have become this person. And I'm the wise person who says, well, I think they ought to be doing this, or really, in my day, we didn't used to do that. And it's about that becoming, as well as about the memory of particular people. How women talk to each other, even if it isn't in they're not agreeing, how women talk to each other about the wisdom that we have is quite particular. And I wanted to create a space in which audiences would come and kind of recognize those groupings as people and people talking and people who, because each of those planks is made up of bits of pianola, door, chest of drawers, musical instruments, I mean, all sorts of things. And so many of the fragments appear in quite a few different planks. So you can see that these people are made of the same materials, but are not the same in any way. They don't look the same. They're not the same. They're all the same length. They're all sort of the same width, except where my team didn't do as I told them to do and make it a little bit wider or added a bit on the side. And so that's, I just went to somewhere watching them making these things. And then I painted them in a way in these kind of groups that I thought I would then split up in different ways when I arrived in Austin. But then I didn't. These people are people to me now, and they belong together in those groups as paintings. So they're not sculptures.
Yes.
They are people, and they are paintings. And they're talking to each other, and there are similarities between them, but they are not the same.
And that's what I think Judy meant when she said to me, the aunties are speaking, can you be quiet? Because they are these groupings of women. And in a way, there's also that aspect that you mentioned at the beginning of your response, which is that indeed, aunties can all be different. They're not necessarily, they can be precarious, they can be frightening, they can possess, there are people that your mother meets for the first time and they're your auntie already, right? Especially depending on the culture and from which you emerge. And I think that, but there, for me, there was something of fear in that, like you say, their lives are all different. But they speak in a particular way. There's something quite frightening about that, and that really was I mean, quite terrifying for me. And I think it's important to note because it's a way to see the impact of how the work speaks. And again, my curiosity is if that was intended or hoped for.
That awkwardness, that tension is really important for me in a work. I'm not looking at a work for resolution, either my own or other people's. I'm looking for some unsolved awkwardness, some in-betweenness, some roughness, some sourness, something. Otherwise, I could just eat a piece of cake. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I'd love a piece of cake. It's my birthday soon. Pardon me.
So 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 if you felt fear in that room, that's probably because there are 64 planks, so that's quite a lot of planks. They are clearly very confident in their groupings. And I guess also they are asking to be listened to. That's why those seating arrangements are there up against the wall. We had an idea to put seats down the middle because that's where seats go in art galleries. And then as the technical staff brought these benches out of one room and into this room, I thought, no, right at the sort of last minute, really, I thought, no, they need to be up against the wall so people will sit on these benches and hear the artist from either side, see them opposite on the opposite wall, and see other people on the opposite wall sitting on these benches listening as well. So again, there's this kind of enveloping of an audience in the conversation and an invitation to have a conversation as well as listen to what these women might be saying. I mean, groups of women are frightening to some people. Some of us don't find groups of women frightening.
I mean, for me, it wasn't that there were groups of women. For me, it was the fact that uh, they were embodied in an architecture that to me was familiar with a kind of tension, and I
Yeah.
didn't know the aunties. I mean, all my people that I surround myself with are women. I don't really have any male friends except for the one that's on Zoom right now, who was kind enough, despite having COVID, to join this call. But you know, I would say that they might identify as non-binary. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not frightening. And I think there is a shift for me in the way that we also have to discuss issues of gender and perception. But that's another thing that I want to talk to you about later, because we have to give people time for questions, and I have one key work that we must discuss, unless you want to comment further.
No, that's good. That's
Um, so,
your
so, so basically, yes, people who are listening, if you have questions, get them. There will be some minutes for questions, but I want to jump to slide 37 actually. So we're gonna not be able. So I was hoping to tell you all that Lubaina Himid had been on the cover of Vogue, which was quite amazing, and maybe let's just slow slide 34 quickly. So the band's been on the cover of Vogue, she's that cool. She is a local celebrity, I mean national celebrity. The UK since Brexit feels like such an island that I think of it as local. And then if you look at slide 35, Lubaina has won one of this incredible award that allows for the commission of a work that I don't quite know. It's in the government art collection, but then it goes in British embassies. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Magda Stavovska and I made this together in the print. The colors not so great in this slide, but that's because we're in 11 Downing Street, and we're not entirely in tune with the government there, so it's an awkward place to be. But yeah, we made this print together, and yeah, you win this award, and then we sorry.
Sorry,
Government art collection. It's sponsored by Robson Orr, very generous collectors. And yeah, and then copies, there are only 32 of these in the world, go all around the world to embassies or government buildings, and can be borrowed from the government art collection in Britain. Yeah, so that's another point.
and so the Bayonet also is a commander of the British Empire as well as a member of the British Empire, and also we turn to slide 30. Also has a public sculpture which is a jelly mold pavilion in Folkestone, which was commissioned in 2017. And what's funny about this sculpture is if we go to slide 29, you'll see these jelly molds, and they're meant to be on their sides, actually, was how Lubaina had envisaged them. However, in Folkestone, it was erected this way. And yesterday, actually, Lubaina, I was at the Serpentine telling someone was asking after you, and I was talking about how you should design the pavilion at the Serpentine. I mean, it really is, it would be wonderful. And I said, we could make a jelly mold. And they said, but there's one in Folkestone. And I said, that's not a jelly mold, that's jelly mold ceiling. And they said, and they did effervescently speak about this pavilion. So you can get your work is in public sculpture. And then slide 27, if we go to that just very briefly, This work, naming the money from 2004, which is actually took a much longer period, is currently on view at the Royal Academy, a very significant show, called Entangled Past, curated or led by the chief curator, which is Dorothy Price, a long-standing supporter and friend of yours, of your work, critical interlocutor. So there's a lot that has happened in that time. If you go to slide 31, that work from the Le Roder series. It was the cover of your Tate monograph, because which was on. And if we go to slide 37, which is where I want to end, we have a project that was realized recently in Sharjah called Dreamboats, which was this was the second time you were invited to be in the Sharjah Biennale. The first time was when I was the co-curator, which was 2019, when we brought home Bone in the China and kept it there. And also, it's when I realized that you were really a big deal in the art market, I guess, because some guy from U2 was also there, who had no idea had lent one of the paintings. So that's pretty amazing. I say these things because they're important to know that it's everybody that's interested. I like that. It's not just people who only collect certain kinds of art. But this work was commissioned by our president at Sharjah Art Foundation and director, who curated the 30th anniversary of the Sharjah Biennale in homage and with the blueprint of the late Okwin Razor. And there was something that you have kindly, generously gifted these street signs to our collection. Recently, you and I and Magda did a talk, and I asked you about this work, and you said something about making space for women in the street. And I guess that's where I want to begin in regards to discussing these works. I think it's a really important point that links also to what you've done with aunties, for example.
Yeah, I mean, when I was invited, I didn't want to have an exhibition in a showing space. I wanted to be in the street. I wanted to be part of people's everyday. And the team there worked incredibly hard, everybody, all of you, to find empty shops that I could place these signs to kind of also try to do things on very different levels, to be on the street so that I was on the street in a very confident way, that everybody, of course, could read those signs, and hopefully it would mean something. It would mean something, of course, in a different way to everyone that read them. And they always were outside empty shops. So I was also trying to sort of encourage perhaps somebody who had an idea of opening a sweet shop or opening a fabric shop to think, well, I might just do that. I might just be able to change my life by doing that. And so it was sort of suggesting that your dreams could come true by starting a business, I suppose, in one of these shops, or using them in a different way. But yes, it was about not being confined to a gallery space, being able to occupy, if you like, in a good way, many of the streets in Sharjah, and to be able to speak to people who definitely had come to the biennial, but also people who were going about their business. And there's a superb photograph of this person going from one place to another.
Who may or may not notice it. And actually, the thing about signs, where there were 14, some of which were moved, and then some of them just remained, and then the wall labels remained. And I remember that people were pulling the wall labels and looking and saying, who's in the Arabic, Mindi, who's this Lubaina Himid? Lubaina Himid. And those curiosities that you seek to interrogate in the cityscape is so important, because you were asking, because you were about to have a solo exhibition that ended up becoming a two-person exhibition for reasons that I think have a very clear politics, which we've discussed, and it's very significant, is that it's about being seen for who you are, about having to argue for it or have to even contextualize it. It's here I am. And the pictures on these are all boats because, as I understand, you paint boats when you're stressed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. After my Tate show opened, I was extremely stressed, and I painted some of the most meticulous, precise pencil drawings of boats that I'd ever painted. I just couldn't go out at all. And I just painted, oh no, I didn't paint at all. I drew boats for week after week after week. It's very, I get a great deal of solace from it.
Which is obviously, for me, it's an important point to maybe end on, is that we didn't begin that you were born in Zanzibar. We often don't talk about it, partly because it's tied to such a tragic story that people amplify and frame so much of the work through. But you were born in Zanzibar, which has a very close and historic connection to this part of the world, through migration, colonization, through trade routes, through boats, through the kind of boats. And so there was an idea to also, for me, was, if Zanzibar being what it is today, more maybe economically, you could have some fun tourism there, but doesn't have a big contemporary art museum. If Lubaina Himid, who did return to Zanzibar in '97 and at other times, but and almost every day in her imagination, left at only a few months of age, could there be a solo exhibition or exhibitions of Lubaina Himid in proximity to Zanzibar? And what I hope I've tried to do uh, over the years since 2019, from the Sharjah Art Museum to the Flying Saucers to uh, your collaboration with Magda across the courtyards, and then with Hur in the streets, is to bring you home, in a sense, because I think that we're in a constant, and I say that really in a kind of nebulous way, in that I think what we realize is that home is a construction that is very much about the communities that we choose to associate with, who allow us spaces and ways of thinking and differently. And the ways that you contour the imagination, for me, are so distinctly your own, even if you are referencing many people, that I feel that I see the world differently. I see it through, in Otobong Nakanga's words, I suppose, through a kind of a dream work, where there is a kind of, the process and practice of daydreaming is a productive methodology through in which to imagine a different version of the present. And so I thank you tremendously for the gift of your art. I hope this hasn't been too erratic for listeners of the rail, because I've wanted to compress so much and also comment and respond, because I like it when Lubain disagrees with me or thinks that what I'm saying is wrong as well, because it's really important to have that back and forth, because I learn so much from it. And so thank you again, Lubaina, and thank you, Chloe, for giving us space. And I guess now, I don't know how we work with Q&As, Chloe. Can I ask you to help with that?
Yeah, of course. I just want to say thank you so, so much, Lubaina and Omar, for this conversation. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. We have a few questions from the audience if you'll have them, Lubaina.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
The first one is going to be from Eleanor at the Rail. Eleanor, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Oh, you're on mute, Eleanor, I think.
Thank you so much, Lubaina and Dr. Omar, for this. This has been amazing. Lubaina, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you know when a painting or a work is finished. You mentioned it's not about perfection, it's about finishing, and I'm wondering how you know when it's done.
Well, I'm often working on several paintings at the same time in the studio. And so before I've finished one painting, I will start another painting, because sometimes the finishing is awkward and difficult, and I need the energy sometimes in a day of starting something, which is always easier than finishing something. So I'm then busy painting the second or the third painting, and I can look at the first painting and see if it's still speaking to me or still saying, look at me, look at me. So what I'm doing is letting the first painting, if you like, rest in the room, where I think it might be done, but I'm pretty certain that it isn't. So I start these other ones, and that gives me courage to look back at the one that I've clearly spent weeks and weeks on. And as time goes by, if it's not calling me and I come into the studio and I don't even look at it, then it's done. But it needs to sit there and rest and tempt me to look at it, despite the amount of energy that I'm putting into the other works. So I still might go back, but there's a moment at which I don't have to look. I can, but I don't have to. It's not that sort of anxious thing. It becomes slightly more of a sort of not so much pleasurable, but a sort of I suppose I'm just investigating it with a little bit more distance and a little less tension. That's about the best I can do.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Eleanor, and thank you for that answer, Lubaina. The next question is going to be from Maxine, and I'm going to read it on their behalf. Maxine says, my brain is fizzing with questions. Love these abstracted figures as aunties. Wonder if Lubaina can say anything about the difference, if any, between the depictions of figures in the paintings versus the presence of figures in wooden planks. Love these varied approaches to relationships of people and figures. I would also add if there is a push or pull or tension for Lubaina between working with abstract forms and more representational imagery. There's a lot in.
Yeah, there is a lot in there, but I have to do those two things at the same time. I couldn't just make figurative work, because I'm summoning people from somewhere to make those works, and it's a lot of emotional kind of energy. And so the abstract, you might call them patterned or abstracted works, even though they're not abstract paintings in the, true art historical sense of the word by any means, but making those works that do not obviously depict the black body are because there are audiences who are the black body and who feel particular conversations or are encouraged to remember particular things that they didn't know they'd forgotten, even maybe. It's a different language that I want to be speaking that isn't in some ways it's easier to speak this language when there are not actual people in the works, but it's also speaking in tongues. So it's an easy language to speak if you're speaking the language. You know, Magda and I talk a lot about language, interpretation, codes, translation. And so there are more opportunities for interpretation and translation and codes to be repeated and reiterated and doubled up upon in those abstracted works. But I am also trying to do that quite a lot in the figurative work. So I need to do both at the same time because they're informing each other. Those I mean, in a way, 22 ways of working are informing each other all the time. So it's not quite an answer. I don't quite have an answer, but that's what's going on, if you like.
Thank you so much, Lubaina, and thank you for that question, Maxine.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the last question, Lubaina. One of the opening questions of your retrospective at Tate Modern was, we live with clothes, we live with buildings, do they fit us? And
Yes.
looking at that question, I couldn't help but think about how you live with canvases and how they embody often the limitations of the frame and they become this vital playing ground for you and your audiences to think beyond the frame. And I was telling Omar in preparation for this talk about my huge love for Slice 10 Lemons, a painting of yours that has a tiny canvas beside it with this 11th floating lemon. And it made me want to ask you what the canvas uniquely unlocked for you as a space, but also, especially as you've worked off canvas so many times and experimented, how that's shaped the way you return to the canvas and the way you think about it.
You know, I guess in some ways I sort of touched on that in the previous question, but in the canvases, I am saying to an audience, come into the painting, step into the drama, be part of the conversation or part of what's happening. So I'm painting an illusion, an imagined space with imagined people doing imagined things, but often very everyday things like being confused or not knowing what they're supposed to say next, or not knowing what the answer to a question that they've just been asked. They don't know what the answer to the question is. So there's a huge, huge moment that happens. I ask you a question, you give the answer. But as I said earlier, I'm trying to paint that moment in between the question and the answer. But you have to come into the canvas for that. And I think that's very important to me. When I'm painting off the canvas, the work is coming out into the room that you're in. So then it is in the room with you, even if it's leaning up against the wall, or it actually is in the room, like naming the money, or the drawers, the men in drawers, are part, and very often the found objects or the often wooden objects were part of other rooms once upon a time, and now they're part of the room that you're in. So those works are coming out at you into your room, and the canvases are saying, enter this world. Oh, it's a world actually you know already. It's a world that you can come in and be part of a conversation, or be part of an argument, or be part of a maybe quite terrifying scenario. Are you brave enough to come into this world? So there's a lot of inside, outside, safety, danger, you know, but who's communicating with whom, you know, I don't know, inviting you to read the color, read the pattern, and then sometimes when an object is in the room, as opposed to a painting is on the wall, there's a sort of, I was just thinking there of the installation Zanzibar we did, that Magda and I did with Omar in Sharjah, where I had made paintings in the 1990s, which were made for being on the wall, but and silent, except a lot of sound in my head. But in Sharjah and in Eindhoven and in Nice before that, they were hanging in the middle of this enormous and beautiful room, and audiences could walk in amongst and around the back of these paintings. So they were paintings that were made for the wall and were very silent, apparently, and very quiet and very watery, then were then in the room, and Magda Stavaska composed, I don't know the amount of minutes, but I'm going to say a 30.
Eight
Sorry?
channel. 8 channel.
Yes, 8 channel, but several minutes, 30-minute composition, more or less. Everybody
30 minutes.
30 minutes, in which I am speaking. I'm remembering making the work. I'm remembering what music I'm listening to. Some of that music is being played. The weather is being discussed. The weather in Zanzibar, the weather in Preston. Huge tapestry, sonic tapestry of material, and that's a case where you are in the paintings are in the room, you're in the sonic experience, and it kind of all happened in a kind of, especially in that gallery, astonishing operatic, multi-layered, multi-level way. Most of the time, it's either one thing or another. But with that installation, I think is a kind of, perhaps like naming the money, but with that installation, those paintings were one thing and then became another thing because of the, especially in that space in Sharjah, because all 9 of these double paintings were shown there. So it was the real thing, it was the real experience.
And there was light, there was access to open light, in the sense that there were no stanchions. There were no labels about the work. You would discover the title of the work by encountering the back. You're a letter to me, but all the text was by Magda and Lubaina. So there was an intimacy. And the way the light would change was that the work would change constantly. And that will be interesting to reconceive of in Luxembourg at Moudam, which will be March next year, if anyone wants to come and see that incredible experience.
Well, thank you so much for that really generous answer, Lubaina. That concludes our Q&A today, but before concluding remarks, I'm going to pass it back to Omar for some last words and a reading.
Well, I believe that Lubaina's work, which we have only scratched the surface of, is what's interesting about it is through the medium or material of painting, we're able to unfurl the inner mind of a polymath who has a curiosity of almost everything and every subject. And that's really what it creates space to conceive of an imagination that I believe is distinct to and of hers. and seeing the young people in Sharjah respond, for example, to the way that Lubaina had painted her kitchen door with this indexical, magical world of references for her, and to be able to say to people, you don't need a canvas or a stretcher, you can paint on anything, was also really empowering. And that sense of it creates what many people are starting to refer to as a sense of belonging without othering, because it is the very process of othering that shifts us into a different realm. And I think that we can belong together without being excluded as others. And one of the things that both Lubaina and Magda are often subjected to is Dr. O, my avatar's merch couture, which involves a series of beautiful t-shirts, onesies, I don't know, suits, jackets, all designed by Dr. O. And for a period, Dr. O was obsessed with wearing t-shirts of Langston Hughes, and both, I believe that Lubaina also had thought that Langston Hughes was a handsome gentleman. And on the back of the t-shirt was this poem, which I thought was a perfect way to end, because it's a very short poem that really expresses what I believe Lubaina Himid's art enables us to think of. So, Dare by Langston Hughes. Let darkness gather up its roses, cupping softness in the hand, till the hard fist of sunshine dares the dark to stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank-
so much. Thank you so much, Omar, for that reading. Thank you, Lubaina. Thank you, Omar, for this just incredible conversation today. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for Florian Pumhoso Lithosphere, featuring Pumhoso and Yuki Higashino. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for being in this space with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Lubaina.
Hope it's not raining where
Thank
you
you
Thank
so
are.
you so
much.
much.
Great conversation.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Lubaina. Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you
you.
so
Thank
much.
you, Omar. Thank you,
Thank you,
Lubaina.
Omar. Thanks, Omar. Thanks, Lubaina.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Cheers,
everybody.
Lubaina. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
So much.
Thanks so much for having us. See you.